Jim Walker, a solitary fisherman, risks his life to save a drowning man during a fierce storm in Crescent Bay. The stranger Thomas hides in Jim's cabin, revealing a military past and cryptic notes about the USS Springfield and Operation Crimson Reef. Suspicious officials search Jim's property, but he protects Thomas, who vanishes, leaving a submarine challenge coin. As rumors swirl and the community shuns Jim, military vehicles arrive, summoning him to a secret naval facility. What secrets does Thomas carry? Why is Jim now entangled in a matter of national importance? The truth awaits. If Jim's courage inspires you, join us to uncover more untold stories of heroism. Subscribe to my channel for gripping tales that honor the forgotten. Hit that subscribe button, share with friends, and let's keep these stories alive. Your support ensures the right things are never overlooked. The storm tore through Crescent Bay with a vengeance, its howling winds and crashing waves a relentless assault on the quiet inlet. Jim Walker, a 72-year-old fisherman, stood in his small, salt-worn cabin, his heart pounding as a harsh voice cut through the darkness. "Are you harboring a deserter?" The words were sharp, laced with accusation, and a blinding light flooded the room, illuminating the sparse walls. Sweat soaked Jim's collar, his pulse racing with a mix of dread and defiance. "He's not hiding," he replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his soul. He's waiting for you to remember who's worth remembering." At that moment, the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. A black submarine rose silently from the waves, its sleek form commanding and ominous, a shadow against the storm's fury. For 48 years, Jim had lived alone on the rocky shores of Crescent Bay, a forgotten corner of the world where the tide's rhythm was his only constant. His life was one of simplicity. Each dawn, he'd push his wooden boat into the gray waters, cast his nets, and accept the sea's offerings, bounty or scarcity, with quiet gratitude. His cabin, weathered by salt and time, held little beyond the essentials, a reflection of a man who found solace in solitude. But beneath his stoic exterior burned a deep resolve, a belief that every life mattered, no matter the cost. The night that shattered his routine came without warning, cloaked in a late autumn storm of uncommon ferocity. The bay, usually calm, churned with white-capped waves and towering swells. Most fishermen had secured their boats days earlier, heeding warnings, but Jim, trusting his instincts, had ventured out during a brief calm, certain he could return before the storm's second front hit. He was wrong. By mid-afternoon, the horizon darkened to a menacing gray, the wind shifting with a violence that felt personal. His small boat rocked, each wave threatening to swallow it whole. Jim's hands, calloused and steady, gripped the oars as he fought to turn toward shore, his mind racing. Then, amidst the chaos, he saw something impossible, a human figure thrashing in the water half a mile from land. His heart lurched, not with fear, but with an instinctive call to act. Logic warned against it. He was an old man, his boat frail, the figure possibly debris, but Jim's heart dismissed doubt. The sea had taught him that hesitation could mean death. Steering toward the figure, his boat pitched violently. The person vanished beneath the waves and despair gripped Jim's chest. Then, 20 yards ahead, they resurfaced, arms flailing weakly. Jim's resolve hardened. He positioned his boat to shield them from the waves, tossing his only life preserver. The stranger clung to it, too weak to pull closer. Without hesitation, Jim secured the boat and plunged into the icy water. The cold was a brutal shock, clawing at his bones, urging his body to seize up. But his will, forged by decades at sea, refused to yield. Each stroke was a battle, every yard a testament to a strength he hadn't known he still had. Reaching the stranger, he hooked an arm around their chest, feeling the faint rhythm of life. The return to the boat was grueling. Each wave a mountain, each breath a victory. By sheer grit, Jim hauled the stranger aboard, then himself collapsing as the storm roared. Gasping, Jim studied the man he'd saved. Middle-aged, perhaps 50, with a lean, muscular build, he bore a faded military tattoo visible through his torn shirt, an insignia that stirred a distant memory from Jim's own brief service. The man's skin was a chilling blue-gray, his body shaking violently. "How far to land?" he stammered, teeth chattering. 20 minutes in this weather," Jim replied, wrapping him in a rough wool blanket. The man nodded, eyes flickering with gratitude before he slumped, unconscious. Jim found a rapid pulse, relief flooding him. He turned to the shore where his cabin's lights glimmered faintly through the rain, guiding him through the darkness. As he navigated, Jim's mind churned. Who was this man cast into the sea's fury? The tattoo hinted at a military past, perhaps one heavy with secrets. Jim's heart, though weary, pulsed with resolve. He had saved a life, and whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the same unyielding spirit that had carried him through the storm. The storm's relentless rain lashed Jim's face as he dragged the stranger's limp form from the boat, the weight of the man pulling at his aging muscles. The rocky shore was slick, treacherous, and twice Jim's boots slipped, his knees grinding painfully against the jagged stones. Each stumble sent a jolt of frustration through him, but Jim was no stranger to hardship. Stubbornness had always been his anchor, a quiet defiance that carried him through decades of solitary winters and lean seasons. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the ache in his joints, and hauled the stranger toward the faint glow of his cabin, a beacon in the storm's chaos. Inside the cramped single-room cabin, Jim set to work with the same methodical care he applied to mending nets. He peeled the stranger's sodden clothes away, revealing a body marked by stories no ordinary man would carry. Tattoos snaked across the stranger's arms and chest, intricate and faded, but it was the scars that caught Jim's eye. Jagged, deliberate marks that spoke of violence not born of accident, but of purpose. These were the wounds of a man who had faced death and walked away, time and again. Jim's hands paused for a moment, his weathered fingers tracing the air above a particularly vicious scar across the stranger's ribs, wondering what kind of life could leave such a map of pain. Shaking off the thought, he dressed the man in his own spare clothes, worn flannel and a threadbare sweater that smelled faintly of salt and wood smoke. He stoked the wood stove until its warmth filled the room, chasing away the damp chill, and settled the stranger on the narrow cot that had been Jim's bed for years. All through the night, Jim kept watch from a creaking wooden chair, the only seat in the cabin. The storm outside howled, rattling the cabin's ancient windows and sending cold drafts that made the lantern's flame flicker. In those fleeting moments of light, Jim studied the stranger's face. Deep lines framed his eyes, etched by years of strain far beyond his age, and a permanent furrow sat between his brows, as if worry had carved itself into his very bones. Jim's heart stirred with a quiet pity, not for the man's physical wounds, but for the weight of whatever burdens had left such marks on his soul. He checked the stranger's pulse, steady but faint, and wondered what kind of life had brought this man to his shore, half-drowned and alone. Just before dawn, the stranger's eyes snapped open, sharp and alert, as if sleep had been a switch flipped off. There was no groggy haze, no disorientation, just a sudden predatory awareness that swept the room in an instant. His gaze locked onto Jim, assessing, calculating, like a man who had learned to trust nothing and no one. "Where am I?" His voice was low, controlled, betraying no hint of weakness despite his condition. "Crescent Bay," Jim replied, his tone steady but guarded. "My place. Found you in the water last night. Half gone. Brought you here." The stranger nodded, a slight dip of his chin, processing the information with a precision that unnerved Jim. "Thank you," he said, the words clipped but sincere. He tried to sit up, wincing as pain flared across his features, but he pushed through on his second attempt, his jaw tight with determination. "How far to the nearest town?" 12 miles north, port side," Jim answered, leaning back in his chair. "Ain't much there. Grocery, post office, and too many tourists come summer. Nothing fancy." The stranger's eyes flicked across the cabin's sparse interior. Bare walls, a single shelf of weathered books, a table scarred from years of use. "I need to stay out of sight," he said after a pause. "Just for a few days." Jim shrugged, his weathered face unreadable. "Your business is yours. Don't get many visitors out here anyway." He paused, then asked, "What's your name?" The stranger hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing the cost of the truth. "Thomas," he said finally. "Just Thomas for now." In the days that followed, Jim began to notice the small, telling details that set Thomas apart. The man moved with a quiet, controlled precision, Every step deliberate, every gesture calculated. He never lingered near the windows, always positioning himself where he could see the door, his body angled as if ready to spring into action at any moment. Once, when Jim dropped a pan in the kitchen, the clatter barely had time to echo before Thomas was on his feet, his body coiled in a defensive stance, eyes scanning for threats. The speed of it, the instinct, sent a chill through Jim. This was no ordinary drifter. While washing the tattered remains of Thomas's clothes, Jim found a waterlogged note tucked into a pocket. Most of the writing was illegible, smeared by the sea, but two phrases stood out. USS Springfield and Operation Crimson Reef. The first stirred a faint memory, a nuclear submarine, one of those shadowy vessels that prowled the deep. The second meant nothing to him, but its weight hung in the air like a storm cloud. Jim folded the note back into the pocket, his lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing, but the discovery lodged in his mind, a puzzle piece he couldn't quite place. On the third morning, Jim returned from checking his fishing nets to find Thomas standing at the edge of the property, staring out at the bay. The man's posture was rigid, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he could see beyond the gray waves to something only he understood. "They'll be looking for me by now," Thomas said without turning, his voice low and heavy with unspoken truths. "Who?" Jim asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Thomas's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn. "People who think I betrayed something important." Finally, he faced Jim, his eyes hard but not without a flicker of something softer. Regret, perhaps, or defiance. "I didn't. I protected it. But they might not see it that way." Jim held his gaze, his own thoughts churning like the sea beyond. He didn't know this man, didn't know his story, but he recognized the weight of a life lived on the edge of something dangerous. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, and turned back toward the cabin. That afternoon, the strangers arrived. 3 men in civilian clothes, their unmarked black SUV stark against the muddy coastal road. They approached Jim as he sat mending his nets, their faces carefully neutral but their eyes sharp, searching. Jim's gut tightened, but he kept his hands steady, his expression calm. He didn't know what they wanted, but he knew it wasn't good. Under the dim glow of dawn, a sharp rap on Jim Walker's cabin door shattered the quiet of the coastal morning. 3 men stood outside, their crisp uniforms and stern expressions marking them as officials. The leader, a man with a square jaw and piercing eyes, flashed a badge identifying him as an agent from the Department of Defense. His voice was calm, almost casual, but carried an edge that demanded attention. "We're tracking a man who crossed into U.S. waters illegally," he said, his gaze locking onto Jim's weathered face. "He might be injured. He might be dangerous." Jim, his hands still untangling a fishing net with the practiced ease of decades, didn't flinch under the scrutiny. His thoughts churned, though. Why here? Why now? The storm that had raged for days had kept the bay empty, the waters too wild for anyone to brave. "Haven't seen a soul," he replied, his voice steady but guarded, betraying none of the unease creeping into his chest. The agent's eyes narrowed, searching for a crack in Jim's composure, a flicker of deceit. "Mind if we take a look around? Standard procedure," the man pressed, though his tone suggested it wasn't a request. Jim shrugged, his heart thudding but his face impassive. "It's a free country," he said, knowing full well their boots would tread his property regardless of his words. He watched as they fanned out, their movements precise and methodical. They scoured the small cabin, its sparse furnishings offering little to hide. They combed the rocky shoreline, their flashlights cutting through the morning mist, and even boarded Jim's weathered boat, inspecting every crevice. Jim stood by, his calloused fingers still working the net, though his mind raced. What were they really after? And who? They found nothing. As they prepared to leave, the leader handed Jim a plain card with a single phone number printed in stark black ink. "If you notice anything unusual, call this number. It's a matter of national security," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Jim pocketed the card without a word, his expression unreadable. The men climbed back into their vehicle and disappeared down the dirt road, leaving only the sound of gulls and the lapping waves in their wake. That evening, as the bay turned golden under the setting sun, Thomas emerged from his hiding place. Jim had sensed his presence all day, a quiet weight in the air, though he hadn't known where the man had concealed himself during the search. Thomas's face was gaunt, his eyes haunted but sharp with gratitude. Jim handed him a steaming mug of coffee, the warmth of the gesture softening the tension between them. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence born of shared secrets. Then Thomas spoke, his voice low and rough. "Why didn't you turn me in?" Jim leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He studied Thomas, taking in the man's battered frame, the faint tremor in his hands. His mind drifted to the storm, to the night Thomas had washed up on his shore, half drowned and pleading for a few days to disappear. Jim had seen desperation before, but this was different. There was a quiet resolve in Thomas's eyes, a man running not from guilt, but from something darker. "A man nearly dies in a storm," Jim said slowly, his voice gravelly with thought. "First thing he asks for is time to hide. That tells me he's either running from something he did or something someone else is doing. You don't seem like the first kind." Thomas's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. "You can't know that for sure." Jim's eyes crinkled at the corners, a rare spark of warmth breaking through his stoic demeanor. "I've been reading people longer than you've been breathing, son. I'm usually right." The words hung between them, heavy with trust neither man had expected to share. They sat in companionable silence as night fell, the bay now cloaked in darkness. Finally, Thomas spoke again, his voice softer, almost reverent. "If anything happens after I'm gone, remember this, I'm alive because of you. That matters." By morning, Thomas was gone. The only trace of him was a small, glinting object left on the kitchen table, a challenge coin, its surface embossed with a submarine insignia and the words "Silent Service." Jim turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the unspoken promise it carried. He slipped it into his pocket, its cool metal a quiet reminder of the choice he'd made. 3 days later, trouble returned. 2 local police officers arrived at Jim's cabin, their faces grim as they handed him a formal summons. Whispers had spread through the town, rumors that Jim had sheltered a person of interest tied to a classified military incident. The local news ran a brief, sensational segment. "Elderly fisherman questioned in connection to possible deserter." The words stung, though Jim's face remained a mask of indifference, but the community's reaction cut deeper. Neighbors who had bought his fish for decades now avoided his gaze, finding excuses to shop elsewhere. At the weekend market, someone overturned his crates, leaving his carefully sorted catch scattered across the dirt. Whispers trailed him in town, a mix of suspicion and fear. Jim felt the weight of it all, the isolation, the betrayal. Each night, alone in his cabin, he ran his thumb over the coin in his pocket, its edges grounding him when doubt threatened to swallow him whole. He wondered about Thomas, about the truth of the man's story, about whether his act of mercy had been worth this price. Yet he said nothing, neither confirming nor denying the rumors. He simply carried on, tending his boat, mending his nets, eating his solitary meals. The routine was his anchor, the coin his quiet defiance. 2 weeks after Thomas vanished, Jim awoke to the rumble of vehicles approaching his cabin before dawn. His heart quickened. Visitors this early, at his remote stretch of coast, meant trouble. Peering through the window, he saw 3 military Humvees, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. Men in naval uniforms stepped out, their movements brisk and purposeful. A sharp knock rattled the door. Jim opened it to find a young officer, his face taut with urgency, introducing himself as Lieutenant Commander Reynolds. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice clipped but polite. "Your presence is requested for a matter of national importance. Please come with us." Jim's first instinct was to refuse, to dig in his heels and demand answers. But the officer's tone, the armed men behind him, told him resistance was pointless. "Let me grab my coat," he said, his voice calm despite the storm brewing in his chest. They drove for nearly an hour, the silence in the Humvee thick with unspoken questions. Jim's mind raced. Where were they taking him? What did they know? The convoy finally stopped at a nondescript compound nestled in the coastal hills, its existence a secret to even the locals. Disguised as a private research center, it was guarded by stern-faced sentries who verified IDs with cold efficiency. Jim was escorted through a maze of security checkpoints, each more stringent than the last. The air grew heavy with the weight of secrecy, and Jim's thoughts spiraled. Had Thomas been caught? Was this about the coin, the card, the choice he'd made? No one offered explanations, and Jim's weathered face gave nothing away, though his heart pounded with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The labyrinthine corridors of the naval facility buzzed with an undercurrent of tension, a fortress of secrecy guarded by state-of-the-art technology. Retinal scanners blinked their unyielding red lights, verifying the identities of the officers escorting Jim Walker with mechanical precision. Reinforced doors, sealed by intricate electronic locks, hissed open and shut, each one a barrier to the outside world. The air was sterile, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, and Jim, a weathered fisherman accustomed to the open sea, felt the walls closing in. His calloused hands flexed instinctively, as if yearning for the familiar heft of a fishing net. The officers, their faces impassive, led him deeper into the complex, their polished boots clicking in rhythm against the cold, tiled floor. At last, they reached a conference room buried in the heart of the facility. The space was stark, almost oppressively so. Bare walls bore no decorations save for a lone American flag, its stars and stripes standing vivid against the muted gray, and the naval insignia beside it, a silent testament to authority. A long, polished table dominated the room, surrounded by stiff-backed chairs, their uniformity a reflection of military discipline. At one end of the table lay a single, unassuming file folder, its edges crisp, its contents a mystery that set Jim's nerves on edge. The lieutenant commander who had guided him there spoke in a clippy tone. "Wait here," before exiting with the others, leaving Jim alone in the oppressive silence. Time crawled. Minutes bled into a half hour, each second stretching taut like a fishing line under strain. Jim stood rigid, refusing to sit, his fisherman's instincts humming with unease. The room felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of stillness that preceded a gale tearing across the ocean. His mind churned, replaying the events of 2 weeks prior, the stranger he'd pulled from the churning waters of Crescent Bay, a man who called himself Thomas. His eyes haunted, his voice rough with secrets. Jim's gut had told him then that the man was no ordinary drifter, and now, standing in this sterile room, that same gut twisted with the certainty that something monumental was about to unfold. The door finally swung open, snapping Jim from his thoughts. A man in his 60s entered, his presence commanding the room with an effortless authority. He wore the crisp, formal dress uniform of a high-ranking naval officer, its deep navy blue adorned with rows of medals that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His silver hair was meticulously combed, not a strand out of place, and his posture was ramrod straight, defying the years etched into the faint lines of his face. 4 silver stars glittered on his shoulder boards, the unmistakable insignia of an admiral. Jim's eyes narrowed, taking in the man's measured steps, the way his gaze swept the room before settling on him. "Mr. Walker," the admiral said, his voice steady and warm, though laced with an undercurrent of steel. He extended a hand, his grip firm and unyielding. "I'm Admiral Howard Carson, Director of Naval Intelligence. Thank you for coming." Jim shook the offered hand, feeling the strength behind it, the directness of the admiral's gaze boring into him. "Didn't seem like I had much choice," he replied, his tone dry, the words carrying the weight of a man who'd been summoned rather than invited. Admiral Carson's lips curved into a faint smile, a flicker of acknowledgement that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, I suppose you didn't. Please sit down." They settled at the table, the admiral's movements precise, almost ceremonial. Jim sat opposite, his broad shoulders tense, his hands resting on his knees as if bracing for impact. The file folder lay between them, an unspoken promise of revelations. Carson opened it with deliberate care, revealing a collection of photographs, technical schematics, and what looked like medical reports. The papers rustled softly, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Carson's eyes met Jim's, searching, assessing. "Mr. Walker," he began, his voice measured, "do you know who you rescued from Crescent Bay 2 weeks ago?" Jim's mind flashed to Thomas, the gaunt, weathered man with salt-crusted clothes and a voice that cracked like driftwood. "Called himself Thomas," Jim said, his tone guarded. "Didn't offer more than that." Carson nodded as if expecting the answer. He slid a photograph across the table, its glossy surface catching the light. Jim leaned forward, his breath catching as he studied the image. It showed a younger man in a naval dress uniform, his posture rigid, his expression grave. The face was unmistakable, though smoother, less ravaged by time and hardship. It was Thomas, transformed by the trappings of military honor. "This," Carson said, his voice low and deliberate, "is Rear Admiral Thomas Drake, commanding officer of the USS Springfield, one of our most advanced nuclear submarines. He was reported missing 5 years ago during a classified operation. Presumed dead after an exhaustive search found no trace of him or any survivors." Jim stared at the photograph, his mind racing to reconcile the broken man he'd hauled aboard his boat with the formal figure before him. The weight of the revelation settled over him like a heavy fog. "He survived," Jim said, the words half statement, half realization. "Yes," Carson replied, leaning forward, his eyes intense. "And you saved him." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "What did he tell you about where he'd been? How he ended up in your waters?" Jim shook his head, his honesty unfeigned. "Nothing. Said he needed to stay hidden for a few days, that's all." The room's atmosphere shifted, a subtle tightening of the air. The door opened silently and several naval officers entered, their movements precise and coordinated. They took positions around the room's perimeter, their expressions unreadable, their presence a quiet assertion of control. Jim's eyes flicked to them, his instincts prickling. Were they here to protect him or to ensure he didn't leave? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he kept his face impassive, his fisherman's stoicism a shield against the rising tension. Carson's voice cut through the silence, now carrying the gravitas of a formal proclamation. "James Walker, what I'm about to share is classified at the highest level. You are being included in this briefing only because Admiral Drake specifically requested it." The room fell utterly still. The faint hum of the building's systems seemed to vanish, leaving only the weight of Carson's words. Jim's heart thudded in his chest, but he held the Admiral's gaze, refusing to flinch. Carson's eyes were unyielding, but there was a flicker of something else, respect, perhaps, or recognition of the man before him as more than a bystander. "5 years ago," Carson began, his voice steady but heavy with the burden of truth, "the USS Springfield was engaged in a surveillance operation monitoring unauthorized weapons transfers in international waters. During the mission, the submarine detected unusual acoustic signatures, sounds that didn't match any known vessel profiles in our database. While investigating, they were attacked." Jim listened, his mind sharp despite the surreal weight of the moment. Carson's words painted a vivid picture, and Jim could almost feel the cold, crushing depths of the ocean, the claustrophobic confines of the submarine. His imagination conjured the crew's fear, the blaring alarms, the shudder of the hull under attack. "The assailants used advanced weaponry," Carson continued, "technology that, at the time, existed only in theoretical research. The Springfield was severely damaged. Admiral Drake ordered most of the crew to follow evacuation protocols, while he and a skeleton crew remained aboard, attempting to save the vessel." Jim's jaw tightened, his respect for the man he'd rescued deepening. He could imagine Thomas, Drake, standing resolute on the bridge, his voice steady as he issued orders, knowing the odds were against him. The sacrifice, the determination, it was the kind of courage Jim had seen in men who faced the sea's wrath and refused to yield. "Official records," Carson said, his tone growing graver, "state that the Springfield was lost with all hands remaining aboard." But that's not what happened. Jim didn't need to ask. The truth was written in Carson's eyes, in the photograph of Thomas Drake, in the very fact that Jim sat here now. "He survived," Jim said, his voice quiet but firm. Carson nodded, a shadow crossing his face. "Through extraordinary measures, Drake managed to preserve the submarine's core systems and evade enemy detection. To do so, he had to maintain complete electronic silence and operate without surfacing. For nearly 5 years, the USS Springfield became a ghost ship, its crew cut off from the world, surviving in the shadows of the deep. Jim's mind reeled, the enormity of it sinking in. 5 years of darkness, of silence, of clinging to life in a steel coffin beneath the waves. He thought of Thomas's hollow eyes, the way his hands had trembled as he gripped the edge of Jim's boat. The man had carried that burden alone, a secret too heavy for words. Jim's chest tightened with a mix of awe and sorrow, his fisherman's heart recognizing the resilience it took to endure such an ordeal. Carson leaned back, his expression unreadable, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion. Pride, perhaps, or grief for the man Drake had been and the shadow he'd become. Admiral Drake's survival is a testament to his leadership and ingenuity, he said, but his return raises questions we cannot yet answer. That's why you're here, Mr. Walker. You were the one who found him, and he trusts you. Jim's gaze drifted to the photograph, lingering on the younger Drake's face. Trust. The word felt heavy, a responsibility he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. He thought of the sea, its vastness and its secrets, and realized that, like the ocean, this story was far from over. Whatever lay ahead, Jim knew he was now part of it, bound by the man he'd saved and the truths he'd been entrusted with. 5 years submerged beneath the ocean's unrelenting depths. It was a concept so staggering that Jim Walker's mind reeled, grappling with the sheer impossibility of it. His weathered hands, etched with decades of salt and sun, tightened around the edge of the table as he stared at Admiral Carson, searching for some crack in the man's stoic delivery. 5 years. The words echoed in his skull, conjuring images of a crew confined to a steel tomb, navigating an endless abyss with no promise of daylight. Impossible, Jim muttered, his voice rough, almost a growl. Admiral Carson's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes glinting with a mixture of respect and grim acknowledgement. Nearly impossible, he corrected, his tone measured but heavy with the weight of truth. The Admiral leaned forward, his voice dropping as he unraveled the extraordinary tale. Admiral Thomas Drake and his 11 crew members had endured what could only be described as a perpetual silent running operation. A submarine prowling the ocean's depths, evading detection while gathering intelligence critical to national security. They had survived through covert rendezvous with specially equipped naval vessels, slipping through the shadows to replenish supplies, never lingering long enough to risk exposure. Jim's mind churned, picturing the claustrophobic confines of the sub, the constant hum of machinery, the suffocating tension of knowing a single misstep could spell annihilation. How had they borne it? The isolation, the uncertainty, the unrelenting pressure pressing in from all sides. Not just the ocean, but the mission itself. Jim's brow furrowed, a question burning in his chest. Why didn't they come home? His voice cracked slightly, betraying the mix of awe and frustration swirling within him. Admiral Carson's expression tightened, his jaw clenching as though the answer physically pained him. They uncovered evidence, he said slowly, each word deliberate, of collaboration between hostile forces and individuals within our own defense establishment. The revelation landed like a depth charge, its shockwaves rippling through Jim's thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, his breath catching as the implications sank in. Treason, betrayal at the highest levels. Drake and his crew couldn't surface, couldn't risk their intelligence falling into compromised hands. They had chosen exile, sacrificing years of their lives to protect the nation they served. Jim's heart pounded, a quiet fury kindling within him at the thought of such loyalty met with such a cruel cost. The air in the room grew thick, charged with the gravity of what had been shared. Carson continued, his voice softer now, tinged with a weary admiration. 3 weeks ago, Drake's team had finally established secure contact, a lifeline thrown after years of silence. A retrieval operation was hastily planned, a flicker of hope for their return. But hope, Jim knew from a lifetime at sea, was a fragile thing. Something had gone wrong. The submarine was detected, attacked in a violent clash that shattered their careful plans. In the chaos of the extraction, Drake was separated from his crew, left adrift in the merciless currents. Jim's mind flashed to the moment he'd found Drake, half drowned and clinging to life near Crescent Bay. The man's eyes, wild with desperation yet burning with purpose, had haunted Jim ever since. He hadn't known then who Drake was, only that he was a soul in need of saving. Now the pieces fell into place, each one heavier than the last. Admiral Carson's gaze softened, studying Jim with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "What's remarkable," Carson said, "is that Drake knew exactly where he was. He recognized your cabin on Crescent Bay." Jim's confusion deepened, his weathered face creasing as he tried to make sense of it. Why would a man like Drake, a naval legend, know a rundown fisherman's shack? Carson slid a document across the table, its edges yellowed with age. Jim's hands trembled slightly as he picked it up, his eyes scanning the faded text. It was a service record from the Vietnam era, detailing his own brief naval career. In 1968, as a young ensign aboard the USS Constellation, Jim had served with a quiet determination, never expecting his actions to echo beyond those years. Carson's voice broke the silence. "Thomas Drake's father was stationed on the Constellation with you." According to Drake, his father never forgot a sailor named Walker. Jim's breath hitched, memories flooding back unbidden, the acrid stench of smoke, the roar of flames in the engine room, the screams of trapped men. He had acted on instinct, plunging into the inferno to drag 3 sailors to safety, his own skin blistering under the heat. The scars on his shoulder, hidden beneath his flannel shirt, throbbed with the memory. Drake's father had spoken of him, Carson explained, weaving tales of a man who'd risked everything for his shipmates. When Jim introduced himself to the stranded Drake, the name had sparked recognition, a lifeline tethering the Admiral to a past he had only heard in stories. Jim's throat tightened, emotion welling up as he traced the scars with his fingers, a habit born of decades spent alone with his thoughts. He hadn't thought of that fire in years, hadn't wanted to. It was a moment of survival, not heroism, or so he'd told himself. But to know it had lived on in someone else's memory, that it had guided Drake to his doorstep, it was almost too much to bear. Carson's voice pulled him back. "Drake left specific instructions," the Admiral said, his tone solemn. "His exact words were, 'If I don't return, help Jim Walker. He's the kind of American we need more than we know.'" The words struck Jim like a wave, overwhelming in their sincerity. He blinked rapidly, fighting the sting in his eyes. Why would a man like Drake, who'd endured so much, care about an old fisherman like him? From the folder, Carson produced a small box, its velvet surface catching the light. He opened it to reveal a medal, the Navy and Marine Corps medal, one of the highest non-combat decorations for heroism. Jim's heart stuttered as Carson placed it before him. "This is long overdue, Mr. Walker," the Admiral said, his voice thick with respect. "Your actions in 1968 were never properly recognized due to the classified nature of the mission. Drake insisted this be corrected." Jim stared at the medal, its polished surface reflecting a face he barely recognized. Older, weathered, but still carrying the weight of that long-ago day. He wanted to protest, to say he didn't deserve it, but the look in Carson's eyes silenced him. This wasn't just about him, it was about Drake's belief in what he stood for. But the medal was only the beginning. Carson outlined an extraordinary future for Jim, an honorary position at the Naval Survival Training Center, where his decades of seafaring expertise would shape the next generation of sailors. A formal clearance wiping away any whispers of suspicion that had clung to him after harboring Drake. A public acknowledgement of his service, both past and present, that would rewrite the narrative of his quiet life. By evening, the port side buzzed with activity. News crews swarmed, their cameras flashing as they captured the story of an elderly fisherman whose courage spanned half a century. Social media erupted, posts and videos spreading Jim's tale to corners of the world he'd never seen. Neighbors who had once turned their backs on him now approached, their faces flushed with shame as they offered apologies and handshakes. Jim accepted them with a quiet nod, his heart too full to hold grudges. Yet none of it compared to the moment that seared itself into his soul. A small group of young sailors, their dress uniforms crisp against the twilight, made the pilgrimage to his cabin. They stood at attention, their faces solemn, and offered a silent salute before turning to leave without a word. Jim watched them go, his chest tight with a pride he hadn't felt in decades. Their gesture spoke louder than any medal, any headline. It was a recognition not of his actions, but of who he was, a man who'd lived by a code of duty, even when the world forgot him. The morning after the naval ceremony, Jim rose before dawn, as he always had. The world might have changed, but his routine remained a sacred constant. He prepared his gear with the same pressure, his hands moving with the muscle memory of a lifetime at sea. The medal rested in its box on a shelf, acknowledged but not displayed, a quiet symbol of a life he'd never sought to glorify. As he pushed his boat into the gentle surf, the sea welcomed him like an old friend, its rhythm steadying his heart. The sky glowed pink on the eastern horizon, painting the water with a soft light that felt like a promise. Jim navigated to his familiar fishing grounds, a cluster of partially submerged rocks where fish thrived in the natural haven. He cast his first net, the motion fluid and practiced, when a strange sensation stopped him. Not a sound, but a vibration, subtle yet unmistakable, thrumming through the water and into the hull of his boat. Jim froze, his senses sharpening as he scanned the horizon. The sea was calm, the air still, but something stirred within him. A premonition, perhaps, or the echo of a life forever tethered to the mysteries of the deep. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon, casting a golden sheen across the glassy surface of the bay, when Jim felt the familiar sway of his small fishing boat beneath him. The air was crisp, carrying the briny tang of the sea, and his calloused hands moved with practiced ease, readying his nets for the day's labor. He was a man of routine, his life etched into the rhythms of the tides, his weathered face a map of years spent wrestling a living from the ocean's depths. Yet, as he stood in the quiet of the dawn, something stirred, an almost imperceptible shift in the water's stillness. Concentric ripples began to spread, radiating from a point some 50 yards away, breaking the mirror-like calm with a subtle insistence that made Jim pause. His hands froze on the coarse netting, his breath catching as he watched the disturbance grow, a quiet awe settling over him. From the heart of those ripples, a massive black shape began to rise, slow and deliberate, like some ancient leviathan summoned from the deep. Water streamed from its sleek, gleaming sides, catching the early light as the conning tower of a nuclear submarine pierced the surface. The USS Springfield emerged with a grandeur that felt almost otherworldly, its sheer size and technological might dwarfing Jim's modest vessel. No alarms blared, no lights flashed. The submarine's ascent was cloaked in a disciplined silence, a testament to the precision that governed its existence. Jim stood motionless, his heart pounding with a mix of wonder and humility, acutely aware of the contrast between his simple boat and this marvel of human engineering. Yet in that fleeting moment, there was no hierarchy, only a shared reverence for the sea that bound them both. High on the submarine's bridge, a solitary figure stood, resplendent in a full-dress uniform that spoke of authority and sacrifice. Admiral Thomas Drake, his posture rigid with the weight of command, his presence a quiet declaration of redemption. Years ago, Jim had known him as a man stripped of rank, humbled by circumstance. Yet now he stood restored, his eyes carrying the weight of battles fought and lessons learned. Jim's mind flickered to that distant day when he'd pulled a drowning man from the sea, a moment he'd never thought remarkable, just a reflex born of decency. He hadn't known then who Thomas Drake was, nor the significance of the life he'd saved. Now, as their eyes met across the water, Jim felt the gravity of that act ripple through time, connecting them in ways he could scarcely articulate. Drake raised his hand in a formal salute, the gesture crisp and deliberate, imbued with a quiet intensity that spoke of gratitude too deep for words. Jim's body responded instinctively, his own hand rising in return, the motion precise despite the decades since his brief military service. His heart swelled with a complex tide of emotions, pride, humility, and a faint ache for the simplicity of the life he'd always known. The salute held them there, suspended in a moment of perfect understanding, where the vast differences in their worlds dissolved. Jim's weathered boat, with its chipped paint and patched hull, stood in harmony with the submarine's sleek power, two expressions of humanity's dance with the ocean's vastness. No words passed between them. None were needed. The gesture carried everything: respect, recognition, and a shared acknowledgement of values that transcended rank or station. After a measured moment, Drake turned, his figure disappearing into the conning tower with the same quiet authority with which he'd appeared. The submarine began its descent, slipping back into the depths with a grace that mirrored its ascent. The water churned briefly, then settled, leaving only expanding ripples to mark where the USS Springfield had been. Jim stood rooted in his boat, his gaze fixed on the now still surface, his mind awash with the weight of what had just transpired. He felt small, yet oddly significant, as if the sea itself had borne witness to something profound. With a deep breath, he returned to his nets, his hands moving once more with the steady rhythm of a life built on honest toil. The ocean had always been his teacher, its lessons carved into his bones, and today it had offered him a moment of quiet reverence he'd carry forever. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of amber and violet, Jim returned to his modest cabin, his boat laden with the day's catch. His body ached with the familiar fatigue of a day well spent, but his heart was lighter, buoyed by the morning's encounter. As he approached his door, something unfamiliar caught his eye. A neatly folded American flag encased in the traditional triangle frame reserved for military honors, resting beside a small brass plaque. He knelt, his fingers brushing the cool metal, and read the inscription, "James Walker, a man who didn't look away." The words struck him like a tide, simple yet heavy with meaning. He stood there for a long moment, the flag cradled in his hands, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. He'd never sought recognition, never thought his actions extraordinary, but this gesture, this quiet tribute, stirred something deep within him, a sense of being man, truly seen for the first time in years. In the days and weeks that followed, word of the encounter spread, carried by whispers and curiosity to the wider world. Visitors began to appear at Jim's remote cabin, their faces eager, their questions probing. They wanted the story, the details of the fisherman who'd been saluted by an admiral, the man whose quiet heroism had earned such a singular honor. But Jim, true to his nature, deflected their inquiries with a gentle reticence. His life had been one of solitude and simplicity, and the spotlight felt foreign, almost intrusive, when a persistent reporter pressed him, asking how it felt to have his life so dramatically altered. Jim's weathered face softened into a faint smile. The lines around his eyes deepened, etched by years of squinting against the sun and sea. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he said, his voice low, his gaze drifting to the bay where the submarine had surfaced. "I just didn't turn away when someone was drowning." In that simple statement lay the heart of Jim Walker's story, a truth as unyielding as the ocean itself. Heroism, he seemed to say, wasn't always found in grand gestures or daring feats. Sometimes it was quieter, humbler, a refusal to ignore another's suffering, a choice to act when others might turn away. Jim had never sought glory, never imagined his name would be etched on a plaque or carried in stories. Yet, in his quiet decency, he'd preserved something sacred, a moment of honor that rippled outward, touching lives he'd never know. The flag by his door, the salute from the submarine, they were not just tributes to a single act, but to a life lived with integrity, a life that stood firm in the face of the sea's vast indifference. And as the bay stretched out before his cabin, its surface calm once more, Jim knew that was enough.